Hello and welcome to a podcast from A3 Management Consulting. This is a special edition of our podcast series. It's going out under the Fueling the Transition banner, but in this podcast we're looking in detail at the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it means for gas markets and energy markets in Europe and beyond. Of course, our thoughts and prayers go out to all those that are currently affected by this terrible situation. With me today, I have one of our gas experts from within the A3 Management Consulting team, Lucy Field. Lucy has been working with A3 for many years and is an expert in European and global gas markets. So welcome, Lucy. Thank you for joining.
Hello, nice to be here. Not done this before, so new to podcasting.
I think just before we talk about the gas crisis currently, Lucy, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your motivation, where you've come from, what is your what's really your drive for working in the energy markets, and how you've ended up here.
So my background is in engineering. I'm quite geeky. I love analysis, and I was extremely happy when I joined A3 to be able to solve problem solving. And when you bring in a management consultant, it's normally because the problem is a bit too tricky for companies or governments to solve themselves. So you're always getting interesting, challenging problems. And I've been working gas markets, which has the added element. It's always been a very political fuel. And I've been working in this market for 25 years, and there have been a number of events. So with gas markets, it's always interesting, but it's not usually as tragic as the current events.
And just in terms of the pressing nature of the current situation, the question on everyone's mind at the moment is: can we survive without Russian gas in Europe and beyond? Obviously knock-on impacts. So, what's your in short? What's your view? Could we survive without Russian gas?
It's very hard to imagine Europe without Russian gas. It's an enormous part of our energy supply, and it is used widely, and we're reliant upon it. So it's hard to imagine how we could transfer away from it. If you give yourself long enough, then there are lots of options that we can try. But in a very short term, it's going to be a very big challenge, and it will test the European Union and how countries can support one another. If something happened to the gas supplies, it would call upon a lot of cooperation and consideration for the countries that are going to be most affected.
And we've seen the EU plan for reducing reliance on Russian gas by 2/3, I think. What's the time frame for that one?
Well, they've suggested it's possible to do that in 12 months, which would be staggering, quite frankly. We have to look out to the global gas market, and there are options for bringing in more LNG. We have regasification capacity. We have about within Europe, I'm excluding Turkey because they've got some terminals, but within the rest of Europe, there's about 200 BCM of regas capacity, and we use about half of it currently, and that can increase to probably 80%. So we have some regas capacity, and there are some pipeline constraints around Europe, so you can't necessarily use it all effectively. But the biggest constraint on that is going to be going out to the global markets and looking as to where there is LNG that is flexible enough or uncontracted that Europe can buy and bring to Europe. There are countries such as Japan and South Korea that have they use a great deal of LNG, and they have a lot of contracts, and in the past they have been slightly over-contracted. So it's possible we could speak to those countries about redirecting some of their contracts to Europe. And the US is the source of LNG that is least heavily contracted. So if you look at Qatar, which supplies lots of the world's LNG, they're heavily contracted with all their production. But the US is bringing on new liquefaction projects all the time, and that isn't so fixed in its contracting. So there's possibilities with the US. And if the US wish to support Europe in this, then that's where we will be looking to increase our supplies of LNG, and that can take away. That might be able to account for a third of Russian gas if that's cut off. We're still looking at, we can't get enough LNG off the global market, but we can get a fair bit to make a difference.
So, in short, it seems very difficult. Certainly, unless certainly if we want to keep the same demand, the sort of gas demand levels that we're used to in the past, it seems quite difficult. Let's sort of go back to the building blocks then, and take it one by one. Some people listening may not be so familiar with how the European gas market and system works currently. So perhaps you could just take us through where most of Europe's gas is coming from and how it gets here.
Well, we have the North Sea, and in the past that's supplied the UK in particular with a great, most of our gas. And sometimes people have forgotten that that's been in decline for quite a while now, and we import half our gas. So there's the Norwegians have used their portion of the continental shelf more slowly, so that there's a good supply of gas that comes in from Norway, and in fact their production is still increasing, and it could possibly be pushed up a little bit further. I've heard some quite interesting talk recently about trying to maximise that North Sea gas. Some of the gas is put in for enhanced oil recovery, so you actually inject gas to get more oil out, because oil has historically been a more valuable fuel. However, despite the large rises in oil prices, it's nothing compared to the rise in gas price. So it may be worth stopping that injection for oil recovery and producing that gas. So there are one or two things that might mean you could get a bit more out of the North Sea. So that's about, if we're talking in rough divisions, the North Sea gas from Norway and the UK might be a third of our gas. And then you're looking at the LNG market for another third, maybe a bit less than a quarter. And then there's been a large part coming from Russia. But it's quite specific where that Russian gas is going to the eastern countries and to Germany, which has become very reliant on Russian gas. So that comes by pipeline. There are huge fields in Russia, and there are very long pipelines that are aging quite a bit. And they've also found new reserves where those huge fields in Russia are in decline now. They've gone up into the Arctic, and around Yamal they found lots more gas. And the best way of getting that out, some of it's coming in to Europe via pipeline, but one of the best ways of getting that out is by LNG. So Russia is sending some of their gas out via LNG, and a little bit of that has come into Europe via LNG as well. So we've got the North Sea. We've got these pipelines from Russia, which have done a lot of the gas. And then more recently, we've been increasing our LNG. And there's been indigenous production. So we've had the Netherlands historically have produced quite a lot of gas, but they've had problems with their production because of localized earthquakes, because of their particular field, which is being used as a swing field. That's filling and emptying it, and that had caused some earthquakes. So they've been cutting down their gas production drastically in recent years. And Denmark's also stopped producing gas. They've gone much greener and said they're not doing oil and gas anymore. So the indigenous production within Europe is, having been quite a lot, has come down quite quickly in recent years. And then in the south of Europe, the picture's slightly different again, because there are some pipelines from North Africa. So Europe has a good diversity of supply, and whenever there have been security of supply studies across Europe, they've relied on the fact there's diversity of sources. But the diversity of sources overall looks good, but then individual countries such as Germany have become heavily reliant on Russian gas, and Hungary and some of those Eastern European countries are still very heavily reliant on Russian gas. And it's very understandable, because it is cheap. It's low. It's nearby. The pipelines that exist already, and it's cheap. So it's understandable that they've become reliant on it. But I think, on reflection, the risk analysis hasn't included possibly all the risks that governments should have been considering. Maybe it's enough to say that none of us expected Russia to behave like this.
Yeah, and then just to think about that a bit further, we've seen some discussion in the news about Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. So Nord Stream 1 is a pipe that goes directly from Russia to Germany. Nord Stream 2, similarly, what's the impact of this of Nord Stream 2 now not going ahead?
Well, Nord Stream 1 is an enormous pipeline in any case. So that really changed the game. So back in 2008 or 9, it slipped my mind which one it was, Russia interrupted the flows across Ukraine. So the thing about Russian gas is it has had to transit intermediate countries to get to Europe. And because of the political nature of Russia with these neighboring countries, it's a highly political thing with the countries it's transiting. So it transits Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. It's Belarus and Poland on its way into Germany. And then Ukraine into most of those other Eastern European countries. It's transited Ukraine, so it's always been highly political, the transiting. So when Ukraine started, disagreeing way back then, they were disagreeing with Russia about transit charges and wanting to charge Russia more for using its pipelines. That Russia does not like that, so they looked for a possibility of a route into Europe that didn't transit any countries. So this is where Nord Stream 1 was so important, because it goes straight from Russia into Germany, the biggest gas market in Europe, directly from Russia to Germany. And that meant they didn't have to deal with their transit countries. And in the past, not now, but in the past, they've had arguments with Belarus. And to be fair to Poland, Poland have been saying for years, don't trust Russia. They've been trying to diversify away from Russian gas for a long time now, and they've built an LNG terminal, have another one on the way. They've built an expensive pipeline to bring Norwegian gas into Poland. So Poland's been trying to diversify away from Russia. And Lithuania did the same thing. They built an LNG terminal. But this pipeline into Germany has given Russia this direct route. So that's the route they want to use. But by itself, it wasn't quite enough to replace all the Ukrainian or the capacity. But if you have two of them, then you can actually replace all that capacity across Ukraine, and then it doesn't matter what happens to the pipes across Ukraine. At the moment, with just the one pipe, you still need to send between 15 and 30 BCM of gas. So this is out of the whole of the Russian imports, say 150 would be normal. 15 to 30 of that has to come via Ukraine in order to meet the demand of those countries in the east. Europe's worked quite hard to improve capacity flowing from west to east, but still, to meet its contracts, Gazprom does have to flow some gas via Ukraine. But if you bring in Nord Stream 2, then you can forget about that. That they can bring enough gas into Europe, although Europe would have to increase some capacity west to east. So that was really the pressure. The Nord Stream projects, the first one, critical in trying to bypass Ukraine, but not quite big enough. But with two of them, it meant that Russia could flow straight into Europe. So that's the power of those pipelines. And I mean, it exists. It's been built. It's finished. It's full of gas. If Germany had given it a regulatory approval, it would have started flowing last October. And that is exactly the same time as Russia cut down its gas supplies to Europe, reduced them to a minimum, or possibly its prices and people aren't taking the gas. It's arguable exactly what caused it. But at the time, they were expecting to use Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 didn't get approval. And that really spoilt the plans of bypassing Ukraine.
And then thinking more sort of globally, the gas market was fairly tight anyway during 2021, as you say. This point about prices and in terms of Russia and Europe, but the global market was already impacted.
Yeah, that came first, really. So what had happened on the global market? So during 21, there were a number of things. The global supply-demand picture was having things thrown at it all the time during 21. There's a massive long list you could come to, starting with a pretty cold winter in January 21 that lasted longer than usual. And gas markets hate late cold winters, because if you're still cold in February, March, gas storage is getting empty, and then everybody gets a bit jittery, so prices get higher. So it started with that scenario, a sort of cold later winter. And then I think there's a fair amount to say about climate change here and extreme weather conditions, because going into the summer there was some really nasty hot spells in Canada and North and America. There was that really nasty hot spell, and that increased the amount of cooling power they needed for cooling, air conditioning, and that drew in a lot more LNG to to that part of America. And then we had a very hot spell in China and Japan, and they needed cooling. So that was demand for LNG going up because there's a lot of power. A lot of Japan's power is gas fired. So and that was during the summer and some extreme weather. And then it was followed by very nasty cold snaps when the winter was getting quite bad. So there's been a number of, as well as droughts in Brazil. I just missed that. So we've got everything. We've got some very hot weather, we've got some very cold weather, and we've got some droughts in Brazil. And they rely on hydroelectric. So they're not producing that hydropower, and their backup is LNG. So Brazil has a very sort of temperamental gas demand, depending on whether they've got the hydro there. They bring in LNG. So they were bringing in LNG instead, and in a market that was really tight. So up until September, it was really the global market that was pulling up prices, and everyone was getting a bit, tense about how high prices were going, especially during the summer when demand in Europe is low and it shouldn't be so high. And then it coincided with this no Nord Stream 2 being permitted come October, which is the start of the gas year, for those of you who don't know. So October is significant because it's the start of the gas year and new projects often start then, and it's going into the winter. It's the start of the winter season. And then Russia's behaviour seemed to change, or its supplies changed. Whether it obviously there's a debate. In the first webinar that we did was looked at some of the commentary on what was happening then. But now it seems, I think, if there was pressure brought to try and get that permitted before you invaded Ukraine, that would have been preferable for Russia. That's a bit political for a mere gas consultant, I have to say.
You mentioned our webinars there. We've done 2 webinars that are available on the website. You can just Google A3 Energy webinars. I think you'll be able to find them that way. One on the 7th of Feb, which was looking at the gas crisis as it was then, and then just on the 8th of March, following the invasion of Ukraine, looking at the impacts and drawing on some analysis of how we would replace all the Russian gas and what demand may change at that point. So then the global market was coming back to the point, Lucy. The global market was already tight. It's unclear whether Russian gas flows were reducing because of political reasons or price reasons at that point. But now we're in a situation where the EU is saying it wants to reduce reliance on Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of the year. One question that comes to mind for me is these contracts, as I understand it, with Russia have take or pay provisions. So that means even if you don't take a volume of gas, there's a minimum payment you must make, regardless of how much you take. And I wonder what happens in the situation where we reduce below those minimum levels, which I think is suggested by this 2/3 reduction on reliance on Russian gas. How Russia responds to that.
Yeah, I think that is where the problem becomes sticky. Because if you're cancelling Russian gas contracts because you don't want to be giving Russia the money to fund its activities, then you don't want to be taken to arbitration and have to give them the money anyway. So on contracts, you could probably call force majeure on a contract if governments declared those contracts illegal. Now, I don't know whether that could happen EU-wide or whether it would have to be government by government that they declared, we're not going to have any Russian contracts and declared them illegal, and then maybe you could call force majeure. Or if the payment methods for the gas that were sanctioned, so the banks, they've been careful not to sanction methods which would stop us paying for our energy. So, but if that was to happen, then that again could be a cause to call force majeure. But at this point, you bring in the lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, so I think there's a sensitive area where Europe can't really just say, well, we only want as much gas as we have to have, but that's breaking the contract. That would be a pointless activity if you ended up paying the money anyway. But possibly, I suppose, if you did it, these contracts spread out across all of European countries. So maybe it'd be a country by country thing. I mean, or maybe we don't renew any contracts. So contracts are coming to an end. The long-term contracts from Russia come to an end throughout the 20s and into I think the longest ones are about 2033. I can't remember the exact date. So early 2030s, some of the contracts will last till then. So you can cancel contracts and not renew them. But the actual act of the existing contracts, it is a bit touchy because I can't see it going down very well, taking below the minimum amount, taking just what you have to have in order not to be interrupted. You can't, do both. So I think that is that is an area for lawyers and governments. I guess they will be consulting lawyers and considering what their options are.
But it's not quite as simple as just saying we want to take what we want to take. There are, there's a lot of other factors to take account of. So it's not as simple.
There is a bit of Russia's got to send it somewhere. I don't know what the production. I don't really can shut fields off altogether. How easy it is to reduce production, or if you shut them in, is it hard to open them up? So there's a sort of actual operational question of whether Russia can easily just cut us off. What they do with their gas if they don't. I had an interesting comment. One of the things is you can send it up and send it off by ship, LNG, as LNG, but apparently Russia doesn't have the technology. They use Western technology to build their liquefaction plant and get the ships. So if globally they're going to sanction Russia and not allow them access to that, or assist them with engineering for more LNG liquefaction or more LNG ships, then that reduces Russia's ability to send it off via LNG. Although I imagine the Chinese could build anything and might come to their assistance.
Yeah, and then I suppose the other option could be that they just flare the gas. I mean, it'd be massive volumes, wouldn't it?
It's horrible for the environment. A lot of this ends up being horrible for the environment, at least in the short term. I think if you're burning more coal or lignite, even oil in some places because of having to come off Russian gas, it seems horrible, but there's payback, isn't it? I mean, this is more your thing, Matt, than mine, because I'm not across the electricity markets. But renewables, the pressure to decarbonise will be greater than ever and get out of gas and all fossil fuels that Russia sells, get out of them altogether. So although in the short term there might be some nasty burning of additional coal, you might find that the pressure to bring renewables forward and suddenly funding renewables seems like a bargain compared to these horrendous prices of gas.
And it's safe to say when we've looked at alternatives on the basis of saying, well, if we were to face a situation where Russian gas was not there, what would we do? But in actual fact, a lot of the things that we would do are probably things that are happening anyway because of the astronomical price of gas currently in European gas markets. So switching out into other forms of generation already going on. There might be some other measures to do with nuclear retirements in Germany, whether that gets looked at again. They're closing their nuclear before the end of the useful life. There are other measures in addition, but in terms of demand response, demand reduction, of course, already we'd seen companies having a lot of trouble with the high prices we had in the past, and now if this is a more permanent fixture, these very high prices that we've got currently, we could imagine that those demand measures might be going on.
Yeah, I mean, prices, you're right. Prices are going to be doing it. It was quite interesting, actually, because one of the things that's been brought up in conversation has been Fukushima and what the Japanese did when they were very strapped for power. They had a sort of widely advertised reduction of your energy use. So everybody was encouraged to switch off lights, reduce the air conditioning. And apparently I heard from somebody who lived in Japan that, the Japanese are very formal and like to dress in a suit for work, but because they were turning down their air conditioning to reduce their power demand, they were allowed to wear short sleeve shirts. It's just the amount of publicity was given to actually reducing your energy demand. And I think that Europe's got quite a lot they could do there. I mean, I've seen it advertised that people could turn down their heating, but there's a lot that we could do to reduce demand just on a domestic level.
And the IEA had a 10-point plan out. One of the measures they suggest was turning the thermostat down by 1 degree. I think that we can certainly go further obviously not affecting vulnerable people, but 1 degree, if a lot of thermostats are set at, let's say, 21, 22 in Europe, not everywhere, but a lot of them, then reducing by more than 1 degree seems to be perfectly possible. And it, according to the IEA's figures, has 1 degree reduction on your thermostat has a 10 BCM impact, so it's not negligible. The other thing, of course, is calls for people to use oil more efficiently, because, of course, there's also Russia is producing oil and selling oil, so reducing oil demand would also be useful. So driving more carefully on motorways at lower speeds can have quite a big impact on fuel efficiency within diesel and gasoline cars.
And working from home, I mean, we've all got used to working from home. So I drive a lot less because we don't need to go into the office as much as we did.
Yeah. I mean, there is a wider debate there about working from home. Does that mean actually we're heating a lot of homes during the day, whereas before the heating might not have been on so much and would all be in one building together,
yes, that's
working
true.
and heating one building? So we have this debate, which, depending on whether people are driving to work, how they're traveling to work, which way is better to organise, and what the impact will be. And actually, we're having that debate regardless of the current situation, more in terms of carbon emissions and carbon impact longer term. What is the best way to organise ourselves? So then, looking more sort of, medium term, I think, with regard to the impacts that we could have. I mean, there obviously more LNG could be coming in the short term, but could we build? I think we've seen some proposals. Could we build more LNG terminals, and where would they get built, Lucy?
Well, Germany hasn't got an LNG terminal at the moment, and there's one underway, which is the closest to completion, Stade. And that would help. So Spain, this is just popping around different bits of Europe, but Spain has a lot of LNG terminals and capacity, regasification capacity, but it has a very constricted connection between Spain and France. So quite a few commentators say that, mention that because you could use the Spanish regas capacity and get it into France. But France also has quite a reasonable number of LNG terminals, so you can get LNG into there. So if you want to get that LNG from Spain the whole way to Germany, there also isn't much capacity going France to Germany. So you'd need more capacity there. So you've got a couple of bottlenecks if you're trying to get it in from the south. And to be honest, it's actually probably better just to build the terminals in Germany, build more floating regasification terminals, which are cheaper, quicker to build, on the north coast of Germany and Poland, where they've got another one underway or planned in Gdansk. So so you get a lot of discussion about the fact we've got a lot of regas in the south, but I think that's slightly a red herring, because where you need them is up in the north, where the main gas demand is, and then it can come straight into the market, and you don't have all these problems with the pipeline capacity and the expense and the time it would take. So that's what Germany's doing. I think Germany's made some very good decisions very quickly. So they've decided that they want their storage filled. They want to fast track these LNG regas terminals. They're going to keep coal burning for a little bit longer. And I can't remember what the other thing was. Oh, yes, they've put a lot of money into sort of decarbonising industry. So they're trying to protect their industry by where they can, so they don't use so much gas or oil. So I think that the terminals into Germany are a good idea. There are various problems. You have to get the right ship. That you get these ships which can store and regasify the LNG. So that as long as you've got the right jetty and you've got a connection to the main gas grid in Germany, then you can bring in a floating regasification and storage unit, and you can start to regasify the LNG. But the global market, I mean, you have to look to the global market to find one of those. I mean, at gas prices at the moment, I suppose they may well be available. So you have to find that, and you have to build the jetty, which can take time. One is already underway, and the other two will be fast tracked. So I think that's what they're looking at, and those are the main locations. There's a terminal in Holland already, and there's one in Belgium. and there's one on the north coast of France as well, and there are plenty around the south. So I think that's where you need them. There's one, the critical one is going to be Klaipeda into Lithuania, because that supplies Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and now there's a pipeline up from there into Finland. It's not quite big enough to supply all the demand of those countries, although Finland has some small-scale LNG terminals. So they're not completely protected, but it's still an actually critical piece of infrastructure for that region.
And this extra LNG you talk about, it could be coming largely, the additional LNG could be coming from the US, is that right?
Well, the US is where there's the biggest growth in liquefaction. There are other projects in Africa, Nigeria, Mozambique, but they are held up by, Mozambique's been held up by fighting, conflict there. But the US has many projects, and some of the existing projects can be what they call debottlenecked, sort of made more efficient, so they can add more streams of liquefaction going out, ships going out. So there's quite a lot that can come out of the US. In fact, that's a whole study of its own. We have a US office, and I have discussions with them. There's a whole model of its own on the fracking and the oil and gas production, because as oil prices go up, there's more fracking. I mean, the America is going to want to be producing more of its own oil. And there's a lot of shale oil, and with that shale oil comes that associated gas. So there's a lot of gas to be had, and at the moment, the actual internal price, if you like, to the US, the Henry Hub price, hasn't been greatly affected by the global market. It's gone up a bit. But as you add a lot of export, that you can imagine, as you export a lot more gas through liquefaction, that might affect that Henry Hub price. But it hasn't affected it so far, and they've had most of their terminals running at full capacity. But that's where there are new projects that haven't been fully contracted, and there's a bit of room in the market for buying some of that. So the US, both a friendly country and has some production, and I have heard talk of what they called freedom LNG contracts. So if governments supported companies to sign long-term LNG contracts at a reasonable pricing indexation, something that is within reason, that's long-term, because the longer the contract, the better the price you get. But if governments could support companies in signing such long-term contracts, you'd have some sort of, they call it freedom LNG. So, from a friendly country that gives you some security. It's basically a sort of hedging or risk management thing to have a long-term contract that perhaps a company wouldn't be able to afford without some government support. It's just that's a bit out there, a bit out of the box thought.
Yeah, and then what about other parts of the world? Any increases coming in Australia, in Asia? You're aware of?
Australia has quite a lot of potential, but it has run wildly over budget on its projects, so it's been an expensive place to get LNG from. I think they have capacity to produce more, so they could bring on more. And I'm not familiar with with new projects in Southeast Asia. There's quite a lot of gas production, but they've also got growing gas demand as they attempt to use less coal. So they've got a lot of gas demand locally themselves. So it's a bit hard. There isn't so much gas coming out of that region because there's growing demand there. Although again, there's this thing about the really high prices. So how quickly they're going to want to replace coal at these gas prices is debatable. Not very good for the world and global warming.
Yeah, and so coming on to that, I mean, this idea of in the short term having higher carbon emissions it really only works with climate change if we are really committed to upping our game on renewable investment. And I think one of the interesting points that's been raised is there is a huge amount of renewable investment that could be happening or happened already, but is sometimes held up in approval processes, which could be now circumvented. So it might be we see a large wave of new projects coming forward, quite a high expectation for that. In terms of this idea of higher carbon emissions in the short term, for carbon budgets and for climate change, then we'd need to have massive increases, a real commitment to massive increases in renewable investment. And there is a huge potential for increases in renewable investment. And quite often, those investments are being held up in terms of approval processes. There are pipelines of projects ready to go in many countries, and especially in Europe. So the more we could see in that regard, the better that would be. One question that comes up quite often from people, given climate change is a really existential threat to all humanity, is whether building out more LNG facilities, locking in basically fossil fuels longer term as a result of this crisis, whether that's a good idea. And I think as I understand it, Lucy, when we do our analysis, we certainly foresaw, quite even with the net zero targets for Europe, we foresaw Russian gas being, before this happened, being an important part of the mix for some time to come. Is that right?
Well, we have plans for hydrogen, and they color code hydrogen for those of you that don't know. So blue hydrogen is hydrogen that is made with gas, where you capture the carbon, or you capture most of the carbon. So if you capture and store the carbon, then you've got a low carbon fuel. You can't capture all of it, so it's not a zero carbon fuel. But so you make the hydrogen, capture most of the carbon, and you get blue hydrogen. That was a large part of the plan, partly because we've got so many pipelines across Europe to towns carrying a gaseous fuel, so you could replace that gas. And if to start off with, you could replace part of the gas with hydrogen and just have a mixture, and then eventually you could transfer completely to hydrogen, blue hydrogen, which is, as I say, a low carbon fuel, and then green hydrogen, which is generated from renewable energy, and so you're not emitting any carbon. So that whole plan to use sort of blue hydrogen and make use of the gas network is at risk, because that would keep gas demand up. You see, you'd still need quite a lot of gas, and that suited Russia, that plan, to be honest, because we'd carry on using their gas for some time to come, as long as you could find somewhere to store all the carbon. Which is some countries aren't keen on that. So there's a bit of debate about the CCS. So to the gas, the prices of gas, obviously nobody's going to want to do that. So that threatens one route to decarbonisation, which looked like a very sort of sensible economic route, in that you could still use some of your existing infrastructure. So that's going to be much less attractive now.
Yeah, but in terms of using Russian gas into the future, we still had a chunk of Russian gas going out to 2050. Is that right?
Yeah, we did. We expected to use it. I mean, another thing is the reserves. So when we do our modelling, we're looking at where the reserves are, the cost of production, and the size of the reserves, both of which are in Russia's favour. And they've got huge reserves, and the cost of production isn't particularly high. So yes, as far as sort of modelling it economically, not politically, it looked like a good source of gas for some time to come, whilst we were still continuing to use blue hydrogen.
Yeah, and decarbonise. I note that another point here is that the LNG facilities could be built to be hydrogen ready. I don't know the technical detail of what that means.
I think that you might be getting slightly beyond on the technical detail. For me, it depends how you're transporting. If you were transporting hydrogen around the world from very hot countries where you were able to produce green hydrogen, and then the transporting of hydrogen is another question. It's
another
pretty
question.
difficult.
It might be better as ammonia or whatever, but I saw that the German announcement mentioned that it would be that the new facilities would be hydrogen ready, whatever that means. And it's one of the key things to bear in mind, that even if you're replacing a gas boiler in the home, you could have gas boilers that were hydrogen ready installed, so that if there is a switch over to hydrogen in future for heating, you're prepared, and you're not locking in essence ongoing dependence on fossil fuel. So I think in all of these decisions, that should be borne in mind, of course, that just because we're saying we're going to try and replace Russian gas with LNG doesn't mean we're saying we think that's the long-term solution to the situation. And it might be that, as Lucy says, green hydrogen in the longer term is the way to go forward, and it would be green hydrogen produced locally or shipped in some form that could be replacing the Russian gas that we were projecting in future we'd be using for some time to come. The other question then comes with local shale production, and of course there were developments in the UK, discussion in Poland about shale gas in Europe, which generally have stopped, largely due to environmental protest from local protest in terms of people not wanting that to be put in place nearby. We have a similar question, of course, on local issues and local visual amenity with wind turbines, and again in some countries quite a lot of opposition to wind turbines onshore, which is why a lot of wind has gone offshore, certainly in the UK. And maybe that should be re-looked at again and reconsidered in light of developments.
I certainly would hope they'd reconsider onshore wind. Shale is problematic because of the protesting. I personally think we could do it quite well in Europe because we would be very environmentally aware, but it might just be too much to ask, and also it takes quite a long time to build up. Those volumes they get in America is because they are constantly fracking, and they're used to a lot of onshore oil wells anyway in these places, so they've seen a lot of onshore activity, which is just Europe is not ready for that. Although I'm not saying there'd be an enormous amount of room taken up by fracking, but imagine the permitting, trying to get anything done in time to make a difference, and then possibly the stranded assets as decarbonisation takes hold.
Yeah. And it's the timing, I suppose, as well, isn't it? Because if we're hoping to decarbonise our economies, if it takes 10 years to really get a shale gas going in Europe, then is that too late anyway? Could we have been doing something else with our effort in that time?
I mean, if we'd done it earlier, it might have saved us imports. And there's a lot of energy used turning gas into LNG and then putting it on a ship and then bringing it over and then regasifying it. You can see that it'd be quite attractive to produce your own gas. I mean, environmentally. So there are some arguments in favour of it, but yeah, the timing would be very tricky.
Well, in terms of the reshaping of European markets, I think we've covered many of the points I wanted to cover. Accelerated deployment of renewables, development of additional LNG capacity, the lower gas and electricity demand that we might expect. Also, potentially some stranded assets that we might see if we electrify more quickly and move away from gas more quickly in general terms. Two other areas which we think about is that, within the European energy markets, deeper cooperation and integration may result from this, that there'd be more sharing of resources, more sharing of strategy and policy. We could see more control and regulation in some areas coming forward. For instance, Germany and the EU both saying that they want storages to be full, to have certain limits on, certain regulations around. And then finally, this point about windfall profits for some technology types, nuclear, hydro, renewables. One asked the question if in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, might be room for windfall profits to be able then to protect customers who are impacted from that. And it might be, of course, windfall taxes have been discussed for those who are making money from gas markets in general. All of that could come to bear. So with that, having covered off the various areas that European energy markets will be reshaped, I'd like to thank you, Lucy, for your time today, for speaking to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. I always like us talking.
Thanks. And again, as I said at the beginning, thoughts and prayers with everyone affected by the current situation, and look forward to talking to you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for listening, and please subscribe for future episodes of Fueling the Transition.